Thanks for joining us today. My name is Damon Fleury. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at SpyCloud, and I'm joined here by my colleague Trevor. Introduce yourself.
And I am Trevor Hillegas. I'm the Senior Vice President of SpyCloud Labs at SpyCloud.
So today we want to talk about our newest release of the Identity Exposure Report for the data that we collected through 2024. This report talks a lot about the different types of data that we've been able to see on the darknet that we've collected from the criminal underground and how that data can impact you as you are trying to protect your enterprise from the things that criminals can do with this data. And one of the key findings in this report is that we've seen an interesting shift, a shift from user-centric attacks, where the criminals are focused on the email addresses that might be attached to your enterprise and all the information they can see connected to that email address, to going way beyond that, to studying the individual that's connected to that email address and looking at that holistic identity that can be connected to that individual. That broader information provides them a much larger view into the total attack surface that they can use, other passwords, other aspects of that individual they can use to attack your enterprise using the email address or the login that's specific to your enterprise. So this has been a really interesting and important finding that we've shared in this report. But all of this comes from the data that we're able to see on the darknet that criminals are using. So Trevor, could you share a little bit with us about what is that data and where does it come from?
I'd love to, Damon. So, when we're talking about sourcing this data, really we're talking about information that comes from third-party breaches. So that's a company or a service that you or your employee might use that gets compromised, and then the data is stolen and leaked on the dark web. We're also talking about malware infections and the data that those expose, as well as phishing kits. So summarizing all of that together, by the end of 2024, SpyCloud has recaptured over 53 billion total identity records. Now, that's a 22% increase year over year. So we're seeing an increase in the amount of data that's available to these criminals that can be used to craft these sophisticated attacks. Now, part of that 50 billion records are obviously individual assets, and the number of assets vary pretty dramatically depending on what we're talking about, whether it's a malware infection or a breach record or a phish. In all, SpyCloud has collected 750 billion stolen identity assets. The important thing to recognize there is the more assets that are available about you or your employee, the more data can be used to craft that holistic identity attack against either you or your employee. Cybercriminals are not just stealing individual credentials anymore. They're now gathering a vast amount of data from multiple sources, which is in turn making their attacks much more effective. So, by enhancing the view of identity exposure using holistic identity matching, SpyCloud sees more than 12 times the exposed data for an individual employee on average. So, this illuminates a larger, more accurate picture of true identity exposure. Now, Damon, would you mind kind of describing what is that average identity exposure? What does that look like for an individual?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we saw this year that an individual, such as myself, saw on average 11 stolen records that were based on their corporate email address. And so that means that 11 different times in third-party breaches, or maybe even a malware infection or a phish event, data showed up through some type of darknet communication. If you looked at the holistic identity of that individual, on average, we saw 146 records. So that spread across their personal email addresses, that spread across older work email addresses or some other organization they were once a part of. That could mean as many as 13 different unique email addresses versus one, if I looked at it from a single user account standpoint, or 141 credential pairs that have target URLs attached to them, which means that that's the actual website that they logged into with that username and that password. There were IP addresses, so you could figure out where the individual was coming from 50% of the time. And on average, that information came from 8 different sources, which could be different malware infections or could be different third party breaches. And then if you look at this from the perspective of a consumer, then we can see that there's an even larger number of records where you might see as many as 229 records if I'm looking at this from a consumer email address and not just a corporate email address. And so you can see that as criminals are pulling this information together and they're connecting it all, then it is really giving them a really broad view into the picture of that holistic individual. And so this is really, unfortunately, empowered and given our attackers more tools to use that we have to be ready to protect against. So, Trevor, how are the attackers using this type of information, and how is this presenting a threat to our businesses?
Yeah. So just like Spy Cloud can aggregate this data and provide it to our customers so that they can protect themselves, criminals are doing the exact same thing for much more nefarious purposes. So we see a lot of these criminal communities online that serve to aggregate this data, that serve to create these holistic identities so that they can target both the consumer approach, which is largely financial, or the enterprise, which is where we look at initial access brokers leading into things like ransomware. So, really, a holistic identity approach is a necessary evolution for understanding and remediating the full scope of user exposures that affect the organizations with which they work and do business these days.
I think a good next question is, what can you do to help protect your own enterprise from attacks that leverage the holistic identity? The first step is to gain access to this type of information, to make sure that you're using the world's best data source that is tracking what the criminals are doing and tracking the information they're using and can be aggregated in a way that you can understand it. There are also tools available that can automate the remediation of this information within your own infrastructure. So gaining access to those types of tools and services are a really powerful deterrent and can protect your organization from holistic identities being used against you. For more information about this, we highly encourage you to download our identity exposure report for this year. You can get it at www.spycloud.com. It's right there on our landing page. Please do review it and feel free to reach out to us with questions. We'd love to discuss this more.